Hi, everyone. Parham Eftekhari. I am the founder and chairman of ICIT. Today, I'm actually here wearing my other job, my full-time job, which is as the executive vice president at Cyber Risk Alliance Communities. And so it's a privilege to be here. Congratulations, ICIT. Thank you to all the task force members. And I think this is a truly, I was just very eloquently said during this panel, this is a topic that is difficult, and difficult things don't often get addressed or approached or discussed, certainly in public forums like this. And so I think it's really it's important that as many organizations as possible step up and be involved. So thanks to all of you. I know we have a diverse group of public-private sector partners. 2 of the 3 big hyperscalers have folks in this room right now, as maybe the 3rd as well. I just don't know, but it's great to have this kind of consortium here. This panel is going to be getting into the findings and the recommendations from the task force. We had planned to have 3 of our task force members here. The 3rd is in the room, but this morning got a board meeting put on the schedule, and as we all know, at least those of you who have worked in the private sector, board meetings trump all. And so that would be Ankur Sheth, who's a managing director at Ankura. But we are very lucky to have 2 of our esteemed task force members. To my left is Nick Andersen, the COO of Invictus International. And to Nick's left is Edna Conway, the CEO of EMC2. I was not as organized as Corey, so I do not have bios. And so I'm going to do something I never do on panels, because I don't, frankly, trust a lot of people to do short bios on themselves. I trust these 2 guys, so I will. I know no one likes to talk about themselves, certainly humble people like you all, but I will ask, just for the benefit of the audience, can you just give your elevator pitch of what your background is, to give some context as to the perspectives and experiences you bring to this? So Nick, I'll start with you.
Sure. So my name's Nick Andersen. I'm the COO of Invictus, like he said, and my last role before Invictus, I was the CISO for Lumen Technologies for a public sector business. It's a large telecommunications provider. It was sort of what became of a merger between CenturyLink and Level 3. And my last role in governments, I was acting as the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the Department of Energy in the former Trump administration.
Hi, folks. I'm Edna Conway. I currently serve as the CEO of an advisory company called EMC Advisors. Prior to that, I was the Chief Security and Risk Officer for Microsoft's cloud business. And before that, I was the Chief Security Officer for Cisco's global value chain. Prior to that, I practiced law for 20 years, and my claim to fame is that I prosecuted homicide cases straight out of law school, and all of them are still imprisoned. I think there is something, Parham, that I do need to address that was, because you know I'm quiet and retiring. And I'm sorry, I can't get over it. It's always going to be ma'am for me. So, ma'am, you said something at the end which was really important. I want to answer that question, which is very graciously answered. I'm going to answer it a little differently. The time was yesterday. I've been talking about this for 40 years, sometimes as a lone voice in the wilderness. And if anyone has ever run a supply chain for any organization, you understand the intricacies of that interdependence. And it's all about business continuity. And what we're talking about today is continuity of the delivery of the capabilities to the people of the United States of America.
Thank you, and Edna, well said, and a great way to kick off this discussion. So, as Corey had mentioned, and which came up during the panel, the report, which is now publicly available as of this morning, you all should have copies in your inbox. You will at some point today. Essentially revolves around 4 pillars, 4 key pillars of recommendations. We will go through each of those pillars during this panel today. Before we jump into that, though, I think it's important. It was mentioned and discussed several times throughout the first panel, but just the context in which, and almost the spirit in which we approach this topic. I think I speak for all of us at ICIT and all of our partners, and hopefully all of you. We are optimistic for the future, right? We are not talking about these issues because we are fearful of the future, or we're fearful of consolidation, or don't think it should happen. In fact, we think the opposite. It's important, and there's a lot of benefits that are coming from it and will come from it. But I think, and after I had the privilege of reading the report ahead of time, I think they did a great job, and congratulations. It comes across very clearly, really emphasizing this whole-of-nation approach that's needed to realize the benefits of consolidation while mitigating the risk. And we talk about whole-of-nation in a lot of context. It's a bipartisan term, so we can still use it in this day and age, which is great. But I wanted to just throw it out to the two of you. Why do you feel so confident and optimistic in spite of what seems to be, I mean, there's a reason people don't talk about difficult things. It's hard. It can get you in trouble. Some folks don't want you talking about those things, particularly when there's money involved or power involved or both, God forbid. And so I'm just wondering, in the context of all this and the pressures and the severity, what makes you confident that we're going to come out of this on the right side?
Well, I think it's in a different government role. When I was a CISO for the state of Vermont, one of the conversations I frequently have with the governor's staff wasn't talking about technology risk for the sake of technology. It was about talking about the fact that we're there because there is a special trust and confidence that we have to abide by on behalf of the citizens in providing services that they rely on every single day. So for me, talking about the challenges that we articulated within the report with consolidation and the risk inherent there, it's really about resilience and readiness and being able to defend those elements of our national strategy. Really isn't just a technology decision. It's about being able to defend our values and being able to defend the things that citizens rely on every single day. So it's just quite simply, we have to do it.
Yeah.
There's not really a choice here. It's kind of like Edna was saying. This is, I honestly can't even believe this is something we're having to discuss, as it is a risk. It's quite obviously a risk. It's just how are we going to address it, and to what degree are we willing to accept risk in this space?
I'm confident because I think I have the privilege of living in the United States of America, where the best technologists live, work. Heck, we even love now on the internet, don't we? I mean, that one still blows my mind at my age. So the reality is, coming from a hyperscaler, I have to tell you, there are remarkable people who are well aware of this challenge, who every day in every innovation are driving resilience and security. So I have faith that our community, both on the public and private side, will come together. Have we done it perfectly? No. Have we started to do it? Absolutely. And so I think this is just the next iteration of how we ratchet it up. And to go back to a question that was asked, how do we address letting those who would seek to do us harm know that we're serious about this? You could tell I don't come from the policy or the diplomacy side. I couldn't care less about telling them just do it. That will show them.
One word that comes to mind, I thought of a lot during the first panel, is just the word trust, right? I think a lot of this too is, and I don't want to go down a different topic, but the society's evolved rapidly because of social media and other factors, where whether it's authentic or whether it's through manipulation from our adversaries, there's just a degradation of trust across the board these days. And so I think it's important that we do this, and because I do believe that by successfully doing this and having these conversations and having folks in a room who you wouldn't think would be in a room talking about these things, it shows that we trust the process, we trust each other, and that we can, like Corey said, we can have folks who, on one level, are competitors, still be working together towards a common outcome that is good for all of us. And so, and I think if you look back on the history of this nation and of the world, really, we've progressed because of that simple value. So I agree, and I'm excited that ICIT is now putting its hat in the ring on this topic. So we're going to jump into the 4 pillars. I'm going to reference a paragraph in the conclusion, which I think does a masterful job just summarizing each of the pillars. And so what we'll do is we'll go through, there's 4 pillars. There's resource, recovery, rehearsal, and response. There's resource, recovery, rehearsal, and response. And so let's start with resource. So from the report, resilience begins with strategic resource allocation, ensuring that digital systems are robust, interoperable, and adaptable to unforeseen challenges. So let's start talking about resource allocation. And as a reminder to the audience, this report made recommendations for the government. This is not recommendations for the users of this technology. So of course, the customers will come up in this conversation. The input of the recommendations are to make things better for them, but I just want to make sure that you understand the context of the conversation and who the audience of these recommendations is: the U.S. government and the administration. So in that context, resource allocation. What are the key takeaways from the report that you find to be, will have the biggest impact and effect if in fact implemented?
I think there's one and only one that we need to start with, which is consolidating under a single agency with authority, and there were some recommendations in the report, to oversee the allocation of both, I'm going to use the word demands, and I mean that in a general way, not a regulatory way. Demands on how we do this, right? I have demands that I make of everybody, which is MFA everywhere. I'm worried about, access to kernel level things, and I could geek out. Sorry, you're smiling. There's another geek in the room. So there are a couple I see. Another CISO who I've had the privilege of working with sitting here. I think that needs to come from the government in a singular way. Some of the things that the private sector struggles with is the reality that there's so much coming at us from a variety of different ways. I mean, I've sat on over 20 boards now, and I sit today on 5. And there's a lot of discussion about how do we operate efficiently, how do we drive innovation, and balance the dirty word that's at the table, which is called compliance. And so I think raising the bar on how the government articulates its goals and sits with us and says, this is how we think we can do it. How do we do it together in a unified, last time I looked, in front of that States of America is the word united, effort. That would be remarkably useful to get us to the point we need to get to faster and more effectively.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. It's really about being able to, in sort of that united, cohesive way, being able to provide these actionable pathways to actually address the issue rather than just continuing to talk about the issues, and being able to sort of work in a collegial way, being able to take your hat off and say, I'm not here to represent a single company, or I'm not here representing an industry. There is an ever-increasing reliance that Americans and our international partners have on systems that are built on this infrastructure, and we have to be able to take those hats off and work together. It was remarkable to me because I did not come from a traditional like emergency response background when I took on part of that role in my last government job, and it was just amazing to me to see the ways that people relied on technologies in just little ways when the worst would happen. I mean, even things as simple as being able to have some small connectivity at a shared computer at a library that was available so people could cycle in and out, log into Facebook and click, yes, I'm safe, when there's been a disaster. Facebook in that moment as part of that's critical infrastructure. We have to be able to provide actionable pathways as government partners in particular, with whoever comes in to take those leadership roles within the next administration. We have to be able to provide actionable pathways to address this risk to continue to deliver on those needs.
And I agree. I think this is one of the most important. This has been said, for years now. This recommendation, in various contexts. So I think it's important that at ultimately the highest level, which is this topic, that we're also talking about this. I have a little bit of I guess, a kind of a practical type question. So the reality is, one of the challenges in that is that who's going to be the one to give, there's not an actual number, but let's say there's 10 organizations right now, or 20, that all have a piece of this right now in the government. And I'm sure there's actually a lot more when you go into the departments and offices. So I'm not asking for a recommendation on where should it sit. Is it DOD or NSA or DHS or a brand new thing? But in your experiences from being in government and the private sector working with government and advising government, what are the things that we need to, like, what's the obstacle from that happening? Is it people not wanting to give up power and that budget they get? Are there institutional processes and things that need to be unwoven that make it really complicated? People don't know where to start. I guess what are the challenges that we should be looking out for and being eyes wide open on as we start to have this conversation?
I think that to answer part of your question, yes, I think that part of it is just, the bureaucracy has a tremendous amount of momentum, and it is remarkably easy to sit in a seat and say, okay, this is where I am, this is my perspective now. I don't want to give up these resources, and I don't want to give up whatever element of control this is, and it's very, very hard to sort of have that wider enterprise level view of what should I be doing for the good of the order. But it's tremendously painful. You look at the types of requirements that we levy on organizations today, even just government to government. So I'll flip back to my state government experience for a minute. I would have to go through demonstrations of compliance with DOD, with DHS, with Social Security, with CMS. I mean, the list would just go on and on and on, with slightly different perspectives and slightly different formats in which I would have to largely address the same thing, which was, how am I appropriately managing risk?
Yeah.
But I had to do that in such a duplicative way because nobody was willing to sit here and say, here's my enterprise view of working with a partner to address risk.
Yeah.
So whether it's a new entity that's created, which God, I hope not, or something else, I hope that we would look at improving the existing mechanisms that we have today. I think we've got a lot of elements of government that have not yet had an opportunity to mature. Things like the NCD, that's the National Cyber Director. That, in my mind, the first word sort of calls it out. That should be the national element that should be responsible for pulling a lot of these things together. And I don't think that it's entirely fair, to be completely honest with you, the burden that we've placed on agencies like CISA. CISA has had to become the everything agency. There's a problem, give it to CISA. CISA will take care of it. It's critical infrastructure, it's cyber, it's whatever. Give it to CISA, they'll figure it out, they'll crack that nut. It's not entirely fair to them as an agency. There's only so much you can do with so many hours in the day and so many resources, and they need to be allowed to focus on core mission as well. That really rambled on. That went all over the place.
No, that was great. That was exactly what I was looking for.
No, that wasn't rambling. I
No.
mean, I think that was a follow-on to, we need to have one authority that articulates what it is. Look, I have a very simple view in life. I think the problem with security and sharing are the carbon-based units, us. I think the solution is the carbon-based units. So don't be fooled by the Conway. I married the Irishman, sono Edna Maria Cristina Pizzoni. So I think everything can be solved by putting people in a room to talk together, preferably with a little bit of lasagna. And I think that I've seen it work. So I had the privilege of ghostwriting NATO's directive on supply chain security. This is a mouthful, for its security enforcing elements across the NATO nations. And if you've ever sat in a room with somebody from Germany and France and talked about cryptographic mechanisms, you can understand that there are varying views. But at the end of the day, because we were in the room more times than I wanted, And because we had a private sector person, me, who didn't have some of the difficulties in being straightforward with other members of their own public sector communities, who could look and say, okay, that's great. You have the best cryptographic mechanisms. I got it. We're moving on. If you have any objection, I expect to see it in writing in 48 hours. Let's keep talking, right? That's the kind of thing that you need to move forward. We don't lack expertise. We don't lack will. And we don't lack the capability to bring it all together. But at some point, which is ironic because I'm a big fan of digital. Somebody said to me, I note you don't have a book or notes, you have a device. And I said, yeah, you know what my backup resilience plan is? I still have my brain. This runs out of power, I'm fine. I'll just keep talking, people, rest assured. But I do think that is a solution. And Nick, love your idea. I will also point out that CISA has the National Risk Management Center under it. I don't care where it sits, but it is the National Risk Management Center. So we have capabilities, we have mechanisms, and we have organizations that already exist to allow us to holistically be thinking about physical, logical, operational, behavioral, and information security collectively from a consolidation perspective.
And if I may add, and this is, I'm not a policy or technology expert. I view the world, frankly, through brands and messages. And the more familiar I've become with the government, a big challenge is just simply how they're presenting what they're doing. I'm not saying this is the case in this, but I've seen instances where the intention was, this is the lead organization, and these are the departments being set up to basically be the liaison between the agency and the top one. But because of how it was communicated and the brand, they all were called the national security thing. The idea was good. The work they're doing may actually be the right way to do it, but it's just being presented in a way that seems illogical. It seems redundant. It seems inefficient. And so I think that, and I said it like 3 times today already in conversations, one thing that the government just needs to do more of is think about its narrative and don't let everyone else control it. Don't let people make assumptions. There's a reason why marketing is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is important to control where you want your organization to go. And the government may not have profits, but it still has a vision and an outcome. And I think the more we don't rely only on the PR office or the external affairs or comms and just get people who understand brand and orchestrate it all together, I think that'll be helpful in kind of accelerating the success of these recommendations. So it doesn't get talked a lot about in these technology conversations, but I think the brand and messaging is oftentimes as important, if not more, than what is being done, particularly in the the digital world where people read headlines and don't actually read the report anymore. So that headline needs to really be thought out and accurate. Moving on to the next pillar, which is recovery. From the report, it extends to meticulous recovery planning, enabling rapid restoration of critical systems after a disruption. So meticulous recovery planning. What does that mean to you, and what are the recommendations that are coming out of this report that you feel are the most would be the most impactful?
You want me to start that one?
Go ahead.
Scenario planning, actually playing out the scenario. We don't do enough of it. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it takes executives and technical experts and operational experts away from their day jobs. They love it. If any of you watched, I was here early. I spent my time sitting by myself unless you came up to me looking at my phone, because a lot of us are very focused on what we're doing, and some of us were not, gifted with the ability to be people, and we're just introverts. You've got to get those folks in a room together and play it out. Any of you have families? I suspect the answer is yes. I also suspect that all of you, I hope you have, and if you haven't, for God's sake, go home and do this immediately, have said, where do we meet in case there's a fire, an earthquake, or whatever? Where do we go? Do we go to the mailbox? Do we go out to the river? What's the plan, folks? We don't do enough of that. And business continuity has been alive and well in enterprises for many, many years. What this consolidation risk goes to the heart of is continuity of capability to deliver what we deliver to the American people. It's complex, and you know who we can learn from? The military. People do not appreciate the depth of knowledge in this area that sits in the U.S. military arena. So I'd love to see scenario planning done holistically with public-private partnership, with some of our military leaders bringing to bear what they have done. It's redundancy upon redundancy. We may not need to get to that level, but we damn well better have at least 2 to 3 layers of it.
And to the earlier conversation, Corey, what's the exercise lock shields, right? It's these things are happening, but are they orchestrated? Are they being coordinated? I'm sure to a certain extent they are. Could it be done more effectively and efficiently? So I think we're starting to see some of these things and bringing in the private sector partners, as Corey mentioned, are 80-90% of the critical infrastructure that the government is supporting and working with. So I think that's a great point. Nick, any other observations on recovery?
Well, I did not necessarily, as a young Marine Lance Corporal, appreciate all the constant redundancies that we found within our nation's military. But I do have to agree with the observation. I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about recovery, it's just quite simply about minimizing impact. It's the worst will happen, whether it is a nation state attack or a natural disaster or one of the leading causes of power outages that I had to deal with in a previous role, which is just squirrels. Squirrels chewing through lines and becoming barbecue was a leading cause of power outages, whether we like to admit it or not. So you need to be able to have a recovery plan. For us, I think it's important to have the discussion about like what is your time objective, to be able to recover. Being able to have that conversation and being able to articulate it, and being able to get in a room and talk about dependencies that you have on other organizations and other capabilities when you're looking at those time objectives for recovery is critically important. We had to be able to, when we're looking at grid security, think about things like black start. I need to be able to upstream identify what is it I'm going to be able to do to recover from an absolute grid outage. I have to be able to have those time objectives, and I have to be able to work collaboratively with partners. The same exact thing is true here when we're looking at digital consolidation risk and we're looking at the digital landscape. We have to clearly think about what is it that we need and what is it going to take to get there in order to be able to have an honest conversation about recovery, because at some point, whether it's a squirrel or not, it's going to go down.
Yeah, and as you're, I think the answer may be in the response to the first question on resources and the recommendation there, but the critical system. So, who of the 16 sectors or of all the agencies, who decides which is the most critical? And if you have to, if there was a, kind of a worst case scenario where you have multiple functions of government that are all equally important, or I should say equally important, are all important to our day-to-day experience as citizens of this great nation. Who decides that? And if you got to start somewhere, would it be simplified? Because I assume today, with the fragmented nature of this, of how kind of cyber is organized, every agency would, rightfully so, say, well, our sector is probably the most important for these reasons, and that's what they should be doing. I'm just wondering if you have any, or if the task force kind of got into that level of granularity, or if not, if you had any personal thoughts on how what is the critical of the critical?
Well, so I don't actually, I can't remember if we addressed any of this with criticality within critical infrastructure sectors within the report necessarily. But yeah, that's a natural part of a conversation amongst, during my time, what was called the SSAs, what is now called the SRMAs, the Sector Risk Management Agencies. We had tri-sector coordinating efforts, to look at amongst the critical infrastructure sectors, what was kind of the core of what enabled many of the other critical infrastructure sectors, and energy obviously was a big part of that conversation. But I had to be able to look, upstream and downstream. I had dependencies on the water sector. I had dependencies on the comm sector. Finance sector had dependencies on the energy sector. Even within the tri-sector coordination concept, there's still interdependencies at play where I don't think you can look at any one critical infrastructure sector and say that is the most important, because it's too tightly integrated to be able to say that one really reigns supreme over the other. I mean, I guess it's kind of like asking somebody to pick a favorite kid.
Yeah. Well, my parents would pick me, obviously. I don't know how our parents are.
Obviously, but it's just it's too tightly it's too tightly coupled.
That's a great point. Edna, what are your thoughts?
He said it.
Okay. Perfect. I will. There's been a lot of attention in the media on the new department. I think it's the Dodge's Department of Government Efficiency. And just hearing this conversation, I hadn't put thoughts together till now, but in theory, right, what we're talking about here is making government more efficient and effective, right? So, there's a, hopefully that's the type of stuff that, I know the headlines are focused on, IRS, how many IRS employees there will be, but I think there's other opportunities there as well. Moving on to the third pillar. So we've had resource recovery, and then, which was actually alluded to, is rehearsal. So from the report, rehearsal cements these efforts, testing recovery protocols through coordinated public-private exercises that expose vulnerabilities and strengthen trust among stakeholders. I mentioned exercise locked shields. That I'm sure there's others that you guys can get into. With respect to rehearsal, I think two questions. Again, what from the report is a recommendation of what can be done differently, and then a follow-up you might want to integrate is, and who do we get involved? And I don't mean just public-private, but from the private sector. What's the persona? Are we getting legal involved? Are we getting the chief revenue officer from these critical infrastructure companies, because we have to partner with them? Who are we, when we go to private sector, who do we want involved? And, well, I won't let you answer.
I think this is right up your alley.
I'm struggling on how to answer this without offending folks. God, it's good to be retired. I think you need the people who actually do it, sitting in a room with government affairs people who have their wonderful place in society when you're trying to figure out who needs to do what may or may not be your best avenue. With all due respect to policy folks, when you're talking about this stage, I think you need the actors, period. They may not always be the most senior people. And then the question becomes, who has to be there? I mean, Nick, you were at Lumen. Important company. I could think of a couple other comms sector companies that would say they're not as important as us from a volume perspective. I think you need to get away from that. And as long as you have one or two representatives from the variety of industries, I think you're good. Now, that's a beautiful statement. I don't know what world that would be in, because we live in the United States, which I'm very proud to be a capitalist. So that means we all are driving towards, you know what business's model is. We're not evil. Business is not evil, but at the end of the day, we have to make money. Even the foundations and the charitable endeavors in which we engage require us to make money. Shareholders require money. So recognizing that means we have to come together with a different hat. Mm-hmm. And so I think the report's biggest and boldest statement is we need to put on different hats as members of the private sector, which is our citizens' hats. And I think the public sector needs to put on its hat to say these are capitalists, and we need to recognize we want them to continue to innovate and be capitalists. How can we help them do that and balance out, not diminishing innovation, not disrespecting intellectual property, but just, Corey, you hit the highlight of interoperability, right? My way's a better way. It's not interoperable because you can't hop from one cloud to the next, because we all think we have unique aspects. I had, and I will not name the group, but a 4-star who looked at me and said, well, Edna, this is very simple. Just do exactly what the airlines do. I said, oh, how is that, sir? Oh, I gave away gender. And the answer was, when there's a disaster or a problem, one airline takes over the customers of the other airline. He said that's because they're all tin cans that fly in the air. They have similar technologies, operations, capabilities. I defy you to do that in a technological situation. They are not all the same. So interoperability is an intriguing concept in this environment, because you've got consolidation, but some of the folks around whom the capabilities that we depend on are consolidated don't always deliver those capabilities in the same manner. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a technical discussion there as well, and that's the reason why I will say once again and reiterate, not regulation.
And it's almost as if there's a responsibility, a personal responsibility on the part of,
You bet.
excuse me, on the part of the private sector. Of we, and I would like to believe it's true, we can make large sums of money and still do right by the country, right by the world, and frankly, probably right by your company in the long term. I think we're so short term.
And they're doing
this
it.
quarter,
They're
last
trying-
quarter doesn't
they're
matter
trying,
anymore.
Parham.
You know,
I mean, there are people
Yeah.
committed to that at every company I've ever worked with. I've never found a lack of that desire.
Good. That's good to hear. Nick.
I mean, I think it's when you're talking about a rehearsal, it's an oversimplification to say it should be a whole of nation effort. Yada yada yada. It really has to integrate governments at all levels, though, including local government. It has to integrate all elements of the private sector, and it has to be a true rehearsal. It can't just be a walkthrough where you say, you've lost power, now what do you do? No, you need to actually, to the extent possible, without destroying things, you need to actually have a real honest to gosh rehearsal. You need to know that if your backup to be able to do a graceful shutdown to switch over mission operations is entirely dependent on that room-based uninterruptible power supply, you need to actually make sure that the ups can work and that it's not just going to turn off when the lights go out. But non-security leaders have to be part of those drills and rehearsals and exercises because the non-security leader, the non-technical leader, those are the folks generally that are owning whatever that mission delivery is, whether it's a company's requirement or whether it's a government's requirement. They have to be brought into the conversation because ultimately they're the risk owner. But we need to be looking at rehearsals that are much larger scale, much more realistic, much more hands-on, and happen much more frequently. We have national level cyber exercises. It's something that DoD participates in. There are elements that DHS leads. There's elements that the IC has cyber exercises that they lead and participate in. But they need to be much more frequent, where we're more iteratively developing how are we going to tackle these shortfalls and how are we going to tackle these gaps based on the rehearsals, and how are we going to apply those lessons learned.
Yeah, and on that point, when you get non-security folks involved, this is where learn to speak the language of the person you're talking to becomes very important, because they will, even in their earnest, they will not understand what you're discussing. Some of them may not care necessarily, which is okay. They're not in the details. So it's like understanding if you're talking to a CFO, at this point, they're there to make money. So let them know how this is going to help them make more money in the short term and long term. I think that's getting those, you're absolutely right. You got to get them involved, but then you got to also change how you're saying it so they understand what you're saying. We are down to our last pillar. So we've had resource, recovery, rehearsal, and now response. That's from the report. Finally, Response reinforces resilience by articulating clear deterrence policies that establish red lines and impose decisive consequences for cyber attacks, targeting, consolidation. So this was explored during the first panel, but would love to hear your thoughts on response. And again, from the recommendations in the report, what would be the most impactful if adopted?
Well, I think the report's emphasis on integrating resilience into deterrence aligns with sort of a broader strategy of projecting strength. And I think it is important to establish clear red lines so that adversaries, whether they're non-state actors or they're adversarial nation states that we see making moves against our critical infrastructure like China, make sure they know that attacks on critical infrastructure and efforts to impact our critical infrastructure are going to be met with swift and decisive response, whether that's a cyber response in kind or it's economic impacts or otherwise. There has to be a known action that will be taken as a result. Otherwise, we're just going to see continued elements of bad behavior persisting. But we have to also incentivize private company participation in this way and how they're going to respond. Yeah. There's real, honest to gosh efforts we need to make, to make it easier for private companies to participate in response and to make it easier for them to share information, to make it easier to expand things like liability protections so that corporate GCs will finally stop talking about liability protection when it comes to sharing information with the government. Those are real conversations that we need to have, and we need to be willing to do it in a way where we take off our hat of our individual agency or individual perspective and say, yes, like there are real problems here. How do we actually solve them?
ICIT we're in a fortunate position to have earned the trust of the U.S. government, and the number of times we get asked by federal agencies to facilitate conversations because they said we can do it, but it would take 6 months for me to try to get a round table of 15 people together because of all the process and bureaucracy. And so, if you guys wanted to have a conversation on this, we would attend. And so I think it's really indicative. The topics, it's things like we've discussed all day today, but I think just removing those almost artificially created barriers to have conversations on both sides. The private sector, there's certain agencies they don't want to walk into because usually you only walk in there when you're in trouble. And so I think changing that dynamic, Nick, is really important. That's a great point. Edna, what are your thoughts?
I'm not so sure about the word red lines. I would call them non-negotiables. So I think there are technical non-negotiables that we need to lay out as a nation, and they need to be deployed across government and private sector. I will not geek out and tell you what they are. I also think information sharing needs to be looked in the context of a democracy. We have the privilege of living in a democracy. As a result of that, we have CISA, the law. We have ISACs, ISOWs, more information sharing forums than God ever intended to be on this planet. And the reality is, remember those carbon-based units? Everybody tells somebody who they trust and no one else. And it's now 6 years ago when then President Trump issued an executive order on supply chains, and the first supply chain risk management task force was stood up in CISA. The number one work group, which it was not number one as in the top, it was the first one. The first work group we focused on was to look at what we thought the biggest threat was. And what we identified was information sharing. And then what we identified was the private sector actually has the vast majority of the information. It's not just security. It's, XYZ product has a flaw, right? And I know about that flaw because I saw, imagine something like lack of connectivity because of a change in solder. The solder no longer they inserted red phosphorus, not that this is a real example. All of a sudden, things weren't connecting. Well, the fundamentals of a printed circuit board are electrical connectivity. Guess what? Nothing works if it splinters, right? You ever solder something and have it break? Imagine that in your PCBA that's sitting inside of this. You could argue all you want about it, it's Apple and that software update. And nah, not really.
No.
Just a little piece of solder that isn't working. To have that information and not be able to share it because you are worried about defamation, intentional infliction of economic disadvantage, trade secret violation, breach of contract. Sorry, yes, I am an attorney. I think those are the things that keep us from sharing. You will never hear this out of my mouth on any other topic, but today you will hear we need a law that gives us a safe harbor that says if you share that kind of information, nobody can come after you for doing it because the greater good is achieved, and do it in a way that minimizes naming names. We can all do that. We can anonymize publicly and get to the point of fixing the problem.
Yeah.
So I would say those two things, non-negotiables, real information sharing, not this is my special group. I only share with my special group.
Yeah.
And even in that group, I really only trust Nick.
I think the way Edna answered that question is actually a good example of why you need different perspectives and expertise at the table, because she answered as a lawyer, as an engineer, as a security expert, and a policy expert, right? She hates me for saying that because she does not like when people point out all the things she's accomplished at, but that's why. Because unless you can connect all these dots, you very well intentioned, you have all the resources in the world put at it, but if you have the right people there who are talking in the right language or they all understand it, you're not going to get to that conclusion. And so, I think right now we're fortunate to have people like Edna in the world who bring all this together, but we need to somehow, scale that, right? And take it out of like these people just have a lot of information to, we have systems and infrastructure and processes and governance that brings all these expertises together. And again, I'm not saying we don't do that now, but I think we as the report concludes, we can do better. We are at time. Thank you, both of you, for the comments. I found it enlightening and a lot of context to the report, so we appreciate it. In closing, if the audience here and those who are watching remember only one thing from everything that was said today, from this panel, what's the one key takeaway that we want to have?
Well, I think the key takeaway is what you just said. It's about scaling Edna so that we can have greater resilience. I think it's that resilience is not just a defensive posture. It's a demonstration of strength. It's a demonstration of long-term stability within the operating environments, irrespective of which part of our critical infrastructure that we're talking about. We've seen what happens when we don't act swiftly. This is a real opportunity to ensure we're prepared for the next wave of threats, and to do so, we have to address some of the consolidation risks to get a greater resilience. We have to stop kidding ourselves. The longer we continue to talk about things like that are real risk within our environment, like competition with China just being competition with elements of an adversarial outcome, rather than looking at it like they're looking at it, which is this is an adversarial relationship with elements of competition. We're just going to continue to punt and think that this is simply a business problem when really this is a national security problem.
Yeah, very well said. Edna.
Walk away knowing that you are part of the solution, and we need you to come to the table for the benefit of ourselves and those who come after us.
Very well said. Everyone, thank you for your time.